Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction and also for inviting me to speak here in this virtual setting. As Jane said, this was originally scheduled to be held last year, and then the world completely changed. So I suppose we're very, very lucky that we have this virtual medium nowadays to stay in touch with each other. So as Jane already pointed out, actually, my research centers on the changes witnessed in the Hellenistic economies, and I'm interested especially in the factors that may have prompted these developments. I focus in particular on the organization of labor and the question of whether this can be held responsible for the economic developments witnessed in the period. In my PhD research, I asked whether such changes were visible in the military sphere, and I'm currently exploring the same themes and questions in the context of civic economies. But given that I'm speaking as a BSA ambassador today, I shall focus on the work carried out while I was a student at the school and discuss once more the results of my doctoral research. The core argument of my thesis is that the military developments that engulfed the Greek world from the late classical period onwards were a crucial catalyst in the development of the Hellenistic economies. And while this connection has long been acknowledged, I have attempted to offer a framework through which it can be better understood. I propose that we should look at the changes in military service through the lens of changing labor relations. And in doing so, I argue that the soldiers who enlisted in the royal armies and in exchange for pay should not be categorized simply as mercenaries, as they so often are, but rather that they constitute the ancient world's first large-scale instance of wage labor. Now, the presence of the wage labor relationship is traditionally taken as an important indicator of certain economic developments. And for Polanyi, also of the Great Transformation, its gradual emergence is responsible for the so-called transformation that culminated in the Industrial Revolution and modern market society. I've been thinking that perhaps we should therefore also give it some attention in discussing the rapidly evolving economies of the Hellenistic world. So today, I would like to begin by highlighting a few of the Hellenistic world's most characteristic developments and lay out in broad strokes how they can be associated with the emergence of wage labor. I will then illustrate how the soldiers of the royal armies fit the categorization of wage laborer. With an eye on the time, however, I shall focus in particular on the armies of the successors. But that said, the developments described were underway from the time of Philip II of Macedonia and continue under the first generation of Hellenistic kings. So the Hellenistic world has long been seen as socially, politically, and economically distinct from preceding epochs. This world arose out of an extremely turbulent period, which in the span of a few decades saw the expansion of Macedonia under Philip II, the conquests of Alexander, and the wars between his successors. Eventually, the vast area that had long been populated by independent polis communities to the west and the Achaemenid Empire to the east fell under the control of but a handful of kingdoms, whose interaction led to what has been called a globalized Mediterranean. When studying the Hellenistic period, the prevalence of military conflict immediately stands out. War itself became one of the period's most dominant characteristics and is said to have permeated Hellenistic culture in all its facets. It was indeed fought on unparalleled scale and with unrivaled frequency. The apparent need for incessant war-making has been explained by the role it had to play in legitimizing the king's rule. The king, it has been argued, was first and foremost a military figure, and his authority depended on the military prowess. As shown by Gruen, this is best illustrated by the fact that the successors only took on the title of king following military victories. The pattern of royal legitimacy and military success endured across the following generations, and thus remained a crucial driving force behind the military activity of the period. The key military developments witnessed were advances in military technology, resulting in highly efficient armies, and a consistent increase in the size of these armies, resulting in an unprecedented number of soldiers active across the Mediterranean, many of whom can rightly be described as professionals. And yet, despite the warlike nature of the period, which undoubtedly affected many a community rather negatively, the Hellenistic age was not all tumultuous and disruptive. Instead, scholarship postulates that the period saw extensive economic development, characterized in particular by increased monetization, the marked increase in trade, higher and specialized production, and perhaps even a drift towards the integration of markets. These developments went hand in hand with apparent increases in the standard of living, as well as more blatant and at times rather extravagant expressions of personal wealth. Not all economies were equally affected by these developments, but while we should take the regional continuities into account, the macroeconomic developments should not be downplayed. Taken together, these have given rise to the view that the Hellenistic economies have more in common with those of the early Roman Empire than with those of the old Greek world, and have indeed been characterized as proto-capitalist in nature. Scholarship, of course, has questioned the reasons behind these changes, and such explanations almost always involve the military. The need to combine the military and economic developments into a single explanatory framework was argued for most emphatically by Austin in a seminal article, Hellenistic Kings, War, and the Economy. Here, he relates the period's constant warfare and exploitation of conquered regions to the king's need to be seen as wealthy and powerful. This feature was exacerbated by the large presence of mercenaries in the royal armies, whose need for pay demanded further and continuous accumulation of wealth. Similarly, the relationship between king and soldier has also informed explanations of the period's significant monetization, and numismatists connect the king's tremendous minting efforts to their military expenditure, the bulk of which likely comprised soldiers' pay. However, while the availability of more coinage certainly facilitated increased monetization and marketization of society, it does not necessarily explain it. So in order to understand the period's monetization, we therefore also need to consider the factors that prompted continued circulation of coinage. Here, the theories and perspectives developed in the field of labor history are of relevance, for they allow us to create such a framework within which the money paid to the soldiers can be associated with wider societal developments. In particular, I would like to draw attention again to the notion of the Great Transformation, which notes that the advent of the market economy and the emergence of wage labor went hand in hand. The existence of markets in the ancient economy has, of course, long been a matter of discussion and lay at the very heart of the fierce debate between substantivists and formalists, a debate that was once aptly characterized as an academic battleground in which no weapon is lethal and none of the battles decisive. This debate was long framed along the lines of a stark dichotomy, which simply asked whether the ancient world was a market society or not. These discussions have reached somewhat of a stalemate, and luckily for us, the study of markets is no longer framed as a yes or no question. Recent scholarship, put some on the slide, takes a more nuanced approach and instead asks what markets were available and how they operated and on what scale. The importance of markets is clear, but I would like to stress that in studying them, we ought to bear in mind Polanyi's dictum that a market society cannot exist without markets, but that markets can exist within otherwise substantivist economies. When markets are attested within in what seems to be an embedded economy, they are said to be peripheral, operating on society's fringes. Such markets operate around the exchange of luxuries or inadvertent surpluses. These markets can also appear and disappear without causing major disruption to society. In market economies, on the other hand, the market is the dominant form of exchange, and individuals become absolutely dependent on it. Economic processes normally associated with a fully fledged market society might therefore very well exist in an embedded economy, but it is the scale and extent of these processes that determine whether it becomes a market economy. Now, of all types of price-setting markets, the labor market, on which the price of wages is determined in line with supply and demand, is arguably the most important one, since wage labor has a crucial role to play in shifting this balance from peripheral to dominant markets. Its role in marketization of an economy can be explained by the simple fact that wage labourers are at once producers and consumers. Engaged in a given productive activity, the fruits of which are simply coins, wage labourers become reliant on the market for the acquisition of their daily necessities, which are in turn produced by others for the said market under similar conditions. The price-setting mechanisms determining the level of wages affect workers' buying power, or lack thereof, and allows for the prices of other commodities to fluctuate in turn. Wage labour then can be defined as work performed on the basis of a contract between a worker or group of workers and an employer, in which the employer remunerates in the form of a wage. The workers should not be coerced into work in any way, and the price of the wages should not be arbitrary, but rather based on market exchange. For a given labour relation to be characterised as wage labour, workers therefore need to voluntarily sell their capacity to work on the market. Naturally, the question of wage labour in the ancient economy has been much discussed. Often, conclusions are drawn in line with the old debate on the ancient economy. And so for substantivists who deny the presence of markets in the ancient world, the presence of wage labour constitutes a theoretical impossibility. Finlay, for instance, calls it a sophisticated latecomer that required a leap in conceptual thinking that the ancient world simply did not manage to take. In this view, attestations of payments for services rendered should not be seen as wages. Instead, they are perceived as token exchanges with prices set arbitrarily. However, on the opposing side of the debate, it is precisely this attestation of payments that is taken as evidence of wage labour. This is, for instance, Loomis's line of argument in his catalogue of Athenian wages. Although the rate of pay recorded is on the whole rather stable, Loomis argues that these wages began to show increases in the 320s onwards, which he attributes to the existence of a market. This view is not generally accepted, and other versions of wage labour in the ancient economy are available too. So de Saint-Croix expresses caution in postulating the existence of the Athenian labour market and argues that while wage labour may have taken hold in some sectors, it probably did not occur on a large enough scale to have had a significant economic impact. The one sphere of activity singled out as a meaningful instance of wage labour in the ancient world by de Saint-Croix is the military sphere. Scholarship has taken the latter recommendation to heart, and in a series of very recent publications has begun to question Athenian economic development from the angle of military wage labour. O'Halloran, for instance, questioning the factors prompting what he describes as the Athenian efflorescence, approaches the question through what he calls an employment demand model, and argues that the large-scale expenditure on the naval economy formed the foundations for a period of economic growth, a process he characterizes as a textbook example of Keynesian state-sponsored demand-led growth. In forthcoming work on the Athenian Navy, Vincent Gabrielson is likewise making the argument that sailors manning the fleet should be seen as the policy's largest instance of wage labour. The criteria of free enlistment, pay for service, and the labourers' ability to influence the price at which they sold their labour are indeed present in the source record. For instance, the events described by Demosthenes' oration against Polycles illustrate as much. Here is described how the demesmen recruited as sailors to man the ships of Apollodorus appeared only in small number, and that those who did were incompetent. These men were then dismissed by Apollodorus, and he mustered a group of highly skilled, voluntary sailors, whom he incentivized with bonuses and advance payments, financed from his private funds. However, when this capital was exhausted, many of his sailors abandoned him and either enlisted on land or joined the crews of their opponents, who likewise offered high pay and substantial advances. The crew's behavior was warranted by their particular terms of service, which allowed them to change employer at will, while their skill set turned them into a precious source of military labor. As we shall see, the terms of service in the Athenian Navy, as well as crew's conduct, were similar to those of the soldiers in the royal armies. An important shift in the nature of military service and organization thus occurred in the 5th century employment of naval crews, and this ought to be seen as an important precursor to developments that came to fruition in the royal armies of the Hellenistic age, during which, I would argue, these processes occur on a completely different scale, involving more soldiers across a much larger tract of territory. So, with the relevance of the labour historical approach hopefully somewhat clarified, I shall now turn to the question of whether the soldiers in the armies of the successors fit the criteria of wage labourers. As I said before, these include labourers' free status and the availability of wages, the level of which needs to be determined on the market. In the context of the military, these can be examined by inquiring into whether the soldiers enlisted of their own accord, whether they received pay, and whether they had a say in the level of the wages received. So in the turbulent years following the sudden death of Alexander, the successors who engaged in decades of warfare in pursuit of a stable and legitimate territorial base could not rely on traditional forms of military recruitment, such as through conscription, and therefore enlisted voluntary forces en masse. So although the successors had some access to conscript troops, their number would appear to have been limited, and the important role that voluntary forces would come to play is signaled by Ptolemy's first action upon his arrival in Egypt. Finding 8,000 talents in his treasury, he immediately exploited these for the collection of voluntary troops. Similarly, Antigonus, when making his bid for rule over Asia in 319, did not expect to run into problems of manpower, since Asia could provide pay without end. The recruitment of voluntary forces, therefore, becomes a running theme throughout the narrative of the successor wars. Judging from the numbers reported, the successors had no trouble in manning their armies. In 317, for instance, Antigonus could field 36,500 men against Eumenes' 35,000. 15 years later, Demetrius found himself in command of almost 60,000 men. The balance of volunteer and conscript forces is not always possible to determine, but where numbers are provided, it seems that more than half of the forces always enlisted voluntarily. A perhaps extreme example of this balance is the composition of the army stationed at Demetrius, whilst laying low in Syria. If we count the Macedonians as volunteer forces, since they could technically throw in their lot with whichever successor they preferred, the troops that can reasonably be expected to have been conscripted from the satrapies, the Lycians, Pamphylians, and the Persian archers, number a mere 900 men out of a total force of almost 13,000 infantry. Naturally, such troops, volunteer troops, had to be encouraged to enlist. Although incentive structures included both pay in both coin and kind, it ought to be noted that the successors appear to have been extremely keen on monetizing soldiers' pay. While we hear of grants of land or gifts in kind in certain contexts, incentives offered usually came in coin. Similarly, while the kings had access to produce from the royal land, which could arguably have been used to supply the armies, Ryan Boehm has recently shown that this produce, too, was deliberately monetized through its sale on local markets. The extent of this coined incentive structure is reflected in the successors' reported expenses for the recruitment and retention of troops. So, for instance, Antigonus is said to have seized 600 talents that were sent to Macedonia in order to pay for his own troops. 3 years later, he collected 10,000 talents from the treasury for the same purpose, 1,000 talents of which he gave to Aristodemus. 1,000 talents of which he gave to Aristodemus for the gathering of forces in the Peloponnese. He is also said to have carried an emergency fund of 3,000 talents at all times. Such numbers are astonishingly high, but seem reflected in the successors' significant minting efforts. So estimates for the annual output of Lysimachus and Demetrius are easily available. These give the following numbers. Lysimachus produced, on average, 280 talents in varied denominations per year, Demetrius Poliorcetes 120. Such numbers can be put in perspective by comparing them to the average output of other entities for which detailed studies on the coinage are available. So Rhodes, a highly monetized and wealthy commercial center at the time, on average minted the mid to 27.5 talents a year between the years 309 and 250. This increased prevalence of voluntary and paid military service went hand in hand with the emergence of documents that we can read as military contracts, of which we have a handful of examples available dated to the period. Such documents specify remuneration, legal statuses, and duration of service. A decree found in the military stronghold of Triangula, dated to around 309, can serve as an example. It records the agreement made between a certain Eupolemos, who was probably a general of Cassander, the commanders of volunteer forces, and the city of Triangula, seemingly at the end of hostilities. This decree specifies that the soldiers of both sides should be able to leave without paying export taxes on their possessions, that amnesty was to be granted to those who had deserted during the war to the opposing side, and that the soldiers who wished to remain in the service of the commander Eupolemos were to receive a bonus, whereas those previously serving the defeated city of Triangula were likewise encouraged to enlist. Such provisions ensured the continued voluntary nature of these soldiers' military service and indicate that enlistment occurred for a set period of time only. The fact that the men were allowed to leave their current employers and were even encouraged to join the army of the victorious general shows that this form of military service had become increasingly institutionalized. At the same time, the soldiers' ability to leave and enlist with a different employer left room for negotiation. This practice is neatly detailed in Eumenes' Ghost Council. While this meeting space was allegedly inspired by a vision of Alexander, it was set up actually in response to the elite soldiers' wavering support. This council, supposedly overseen by Alexander's ghost, then served as an institutionalized space for negotiation and deliberation between Eumenes and his men. That negotiation between king and soldiers occurred can also be seen in other armies. For instance, when campaigning in Gaza, Antigonus offered his army the option to press on or to withdraw. The army opted for the latter course of action, and Antigonus duly obliged. Antigonus thereby effectively gave his army a say in the military and strategic policy to be followed. More importantly, by asking whether the soldiers wanted to continue the march, he inquired into their willingness to extend the duration of their service and the tasks they were willing to perform. Soldiers often seem motivated by personal gain, and we can see the successors engage in what may be described as bidding wars. So, for example, it can be noted that when Eumenes recruited forces, he is said to have done so by sending out recruiters and establishing a notable rate of pay. This pay being worthy of consideration, 12,000 men are said to have reported of their own accord, coming from as wide an area as the adjacent regions of Cilicia, from Syria and Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Greece. The offer of higher wages, furthermore, was not only a key incentive for the enlistment of new recruits, but it was also used as a weapon to tempt soldiers away from competitors and put them at a numerical disadvantage. This process should perhaps be seen as a reason behind many accounts of desertion in these armies. We can see Ptolemy employing these methods, and he is said to have offered one-off payments of 2 minae to each of the ordinary soldiers and 1 talent to commanders who would enlist with him in favor of Antigonus. The awareness that it was ultimately the soldiers' desire for monetary gain that inspired loyalty can be illustrated by the events surrounding the potential desertion of the Ptolemaic commander Athanagoras, then stationed at Rhodes. After receiving an offer from Demetrius, Athanagoras is said to have pretended to accept, but at the same time disclosed it to his superiors. The latter responded by awarding him public honors as well as a bonus of 5 talents, allegedly in order to inspire loyalty towards the demons from the other men who were paid soldiers and foreigners. To my mind, the case of Athanagoras shows that there was mutual understanding that loyalty or allegiance was inspired by financial gain. While the Rhodians honored Athanagoras in the usual way, presumably they set up an inscription, They also felt the need to award them with a significant amount of money. At the same time, Athenagoras' handling of the matter could be seen as a deliberate play to achieve precisely this objective. Thus, the successor wars created a situation in which a number of employers, the kings and commanders, competed for the service of soldiers who keenly negotiated their terms of enlistment and the price of their labour. Noticeably, both employers and soldiers appear to have been acutely aware of the new nature of their military relationship, and the soldiers responded with financial rather than political or moral incentives. Any successor in need of troops therefore had to match and preferably go beyond the offers of his rivals. The conditions for the emergence of a labour market were thus established. So, to sum up, although military service is not usually perceived as being a form of work, I hope to have shown that it can indeed be considered such. More importantly, developments of paid military recruitment set in motion by Philip and Alexander culminated during the Wars of the Successors, by which time we can readily see employment in the armies as a large-scale and widely spread instance of wage labour. The soldiers' specific conditions of service and the competition for their employment also prompted the emergence of a market for such military labour. I argue, therefore, that the emergence of this specific market should be viewed as a vital catalyst in the development of the early Hellenistic economies, and in particular in the expansion of market exchange. Because these wage-labouring soldiers were paid predominantly in coin, they became dependent on markets for their daily upkeep, and thus amplified the process of marketization. Such a model, of course, assumes that wage labour begets wage labour. That is to say, it expects a sort of domino effect of labour specialization in order to satisfy the demands of those emerging and in time established markets. And so I think it is important that we should also look for changing relationships in other prominent sectors of productive activity. Indications for this do exist, but there needs some more teasing out. And so, for instance, it has been pointed out already that the language associated with work in the epigraphic records signals that attitudes changed over the course of the Hellenistic age. Similarly, there are signs that certain specialist jobs, which were largely carried out by slaves in the classical period, came to be occupied by hired workers. The challenge for me, and hopefully others, is to uncover and critically bring together other such instances to help build a fuller and more informed labour history of the Hellenistic age. Thank you for listening.